In the grand tapestry of history, few eras have shaped women's behavior, expectations, emotions, and cultural norms as profoundly as the Victorian period. Under the long reign of Queen Victoria, which lasted from 1837 to 1901, this era was marked not only by industrial advancement and imperial expansion, but also by a deeply encoded set of social rules, especially for women of status. To be a proper Victorian lady meant living within a carefully constructed framework of virtue, modesty, discipline, and grace. Everything from the way one spoke, dressed, walked, sat, interacted with others, managed a household, or even wrote a letter, was meticulously governed by unwritten but universally accepted principles. These rules created a symbolic femininity that stood as a sign of dignity, elegance, and moral superiority at a time when a woman's reputation was often her most valuable asset. A day in the life of a Victorian lady did not begin with the urgent ringing of alarm clocks or frantic glances at phones, but with a ritual, quiet, calm, and intentional. Upon waking, she might kneel at her bedside and whisper sincere morning prayer, thanking God for the privilege of another day and seeking strength to fulfill her duties with humility and grace. After all, religion was the spiritual compass of Victorian homes, especially among the middle and upper classes, and a proper lady was expected to demonstrate her piety not only in worship, but in every interaction and decision. Next came the toilet habits, an indispensable part of a lady's morning routine. This was not merely about cleanliness, though that was important. The toilette was a daily ceremony of modest grooming and gentle refinement, often supervised by a lady's maid if the family was wealthy enough to afford one. Hair would be brushed, exactly 100 strokes for health and shine, then arranged into a tidy bun or soft curls. Skin would be gently cleansed with rose water or milk-based solutions, followed, if she dared, by a dusting of rice powder or a hint of blush. Heavy cosmetics were frowned upon during this era. A lady's beauty was expected to be natural, or at least appear so, as a reflection of her inner virtue, not her vanity. Dressing was another sacred and significant part of the morning. A woman didn't simply put on a dress. Layers were essential. First came the chemise, then the corset, tightly laced, but never to the point of fainting. A true lady maintained her poise, even under constraint. Then came one or more petticoats, followed by an outer gown made of wool or cotton for daytime, or silk or taffeta for evening. Gloves, bonnets, parasols, and buttoned boots were outdoor essentials. The key was modesty. To show too much skin or reveal the shape of one's body beneath was not only improper but scandalous. A woman's clothing reflected her respectability, and a well-bred lady ensured that every ribbon, hemline, and collar conformed to the most refined trends. Breakfast, usually served early in her room, was a quiet affair, accompanied by light conversation and the rustle of newspapers. Women were expected to eat with elegance and delicacy. No loud chewing, no speaking with a full mouth, no smacking, and definitely no unsolicited second helpings. A modest toast, boiled egg, tea, or a piece of fruit was more typical, and the act of sipping tea had its own subtle rules. Contrary to popular belief, the pinky was not to be raised. This was considered a faux pas. Instead, a lady would hold her teacup gracefully, fingers naturally curled, maintaining eye contact during polite conversation. Throughout the day, the schedule of a Victorian woman was filled with pursuits that refined both mind and spirit. Music lessons, often piano or harp, were part of cultivating grace and gentility in a young lady. A refined woman might spend part of her morning practicing a Chopin nocturne or Schumann etude, seated with perfect posture at the piano bench. Needlework followed. Embroidery, mending, or lace making was not merely a way to pass time, but a demonstration of patience, virtue, and usefulness. A well-crafted embroidery could become a family heirloom or a cherished gift for a husband or child. Reading was another cornerstone of female accomplishment. Novels were permitted, especially those by authors like Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, or the Bronte sisters. But reading material was chosen with care. Sensational or romantic pulp fiction was frowned upon. A proper lady read to broaden her mind, refine her speech, and develop moral awareness. Many also kept journals, copying favorite poems, Bible verses, or reflections on daily life, demonstrating introspection and emotional intelligence. When receiving guests or making social calls, etiquette became a ballet of precisely choreographed manners. Calling cards were exchanged, times were strictly scheduled, and unless explicitly invited to stay longer, visits were expected to last no more than 15 minutes. A proper lady knew how to engage in conversation, witty but never rude, never interrupting, always listening with attentive interest. Laughter was gentle, never loud. One did not guffaw in such settings. Topics ranged from literature to church sermons to family news. Politics, bodily functions, or gossip were strictly forbidden. And above all, kindness toward servants, respect for the elderly, and unwavering courtesy to all, regardless of rank, were expected. Charity and philanthropy were also expected from women who did not have to work. Visiting the poor and needy, organizing church fundraisers, or sewing clothes for orphans were common. But charity was not for boasting. It was not a display of social superiority, but an expression of Christian duty. A lady's goodness was to be quiet and consistent, not loud or showy. Much attention was paid to this principle. Afternoons might include walks in the garden or parks, accompanied by husbands, if married, or by a companion. Physical activity was encouraged in moderation, but vigorous exertion and sweating were considered unladylike. Horseback riding, croquet, or light calisthenics were acceptable. Exposure to fresh air was believed to maintain a lady's complexion and spirit. Dinners were held more formally. Men and women dined together, but conversation remained polite and measured. After dinner, women typically retired to the drawing room, while men stayed behind to smoke cigars and discuss business or politics. This separation was not viewed as exclusionary, but rather as a way of preserving the sanctity and purity of female discourse. In the drawing room, women might sing, play music, or share anecdotes, displaying charm and cultural refinement. In short, they engaged in conversation and companionship among themselves. In all of her activities, a proper Victorian lady was expected to maintain a sense of duty to her family, her community, her moral compass, and above all, to her appearance as an exemplar of feminine virtue. The ideology of separate spheres prevailed at the time. Men belonged to the public realm, politics and business, while women were guardians of the private realm, home, morality, and culture. And within that realm, her influence was immense. Though often unacknowledged in history books, she shaped the next generation. She preserved tradition. She was the silent center around which the domestic world revolved. And yet, beneath all that elegance and order, There were complexities. Not all women living in this era passively adhered to the rules. Many women used the tools of politeness to cross and even stretch social boundaries. The letters, diaries, and novels of that period reveal rich inner lives filled with intellectual ambition, emotional depth, and in some cases, silent rebellion. Some women sought education, some pursued reform, and others pushed the boundaries of what ladyship meant, even within the constraints that defined it. Keep in mind, behaving like a proper Victorian lady was not just about following rules. It was about embracing a role filled with centuries-old traditions, idealism, and restrictions. It was an art, a performance, and often a silent resistance. Beyond the elegant skirts, teacups, and gracefully gloved hands, there was a deeper reality, one often overlooked in romantic depictions of the Victorian era. While the surface of a proper lady's life sparkled with controlled and magnificent grace, beneath it lay the immense emotional discipline and internal negotiation required to maintain that image. Victorian womanhood was not only about outward behavior, it was about assuming a role that society had designed with strict expectations and almost no flexibility. To be a proper lady in this order meant walking a narrow path between virtue and oppression, self-sacrifice and silent endurance. First, let us understand the foundation of a lady's power in society during this era, her reputation. In Victorian society, a woman's virtue was essentially tied to her public image. Whether it was real or a rumor, a single impropriety could ruin her chances of a good marriage, exile her from polite and nostalgic society, and mark her forever with shame. For this reason, girls were taught from a young age not only to control their behavior, but also their thoughts, expressions, and even their glances. Eye contact when looking at a man, a comment spoken too freely, or laughing too loudly could be interpreted as inappropriate. Girls were often reminded that their behavior reflected not only themselves, but also the honor of their entire families. This careful attention extended most strongly to matters of love. Courtship was not a spontaneous act driven by romantic passion. It was often orchestrated by families and observed with the seriousness of diplomatic negotiation. For young ladies of marriageable age, meeting suitable men occurred during dances, garden parties, and church outings. Yet even in these relatively relaxed settings, every move and word was carefully observed. A lady could never appear too eager, too forward-thinking, or too intelligent. While attracting a potential suitor, she was also expected to demonstrate modesty, agreeableness, and courtesy. This delicate dance required mastery in social cues, a well-timed smile, a gentle laugh, the subtle dropping of a glove. Chaperones were standard practice. A lady was never to be alone with a man who was not a relative. Even the correspondence between courting partners was subject to scrutiny, often read by parents or guardians before being sent or received. The content of these letters had to be affectionate, but always measured, hinting at emotion, but never crossing into passion. Even if a proper Victorian lady desired to, she would never openly express longing. Her emotions were expected to remain within the bounds of purity and modesty. Once a proposal was made and accepted, the woman's behavior was to reflect gratitude and humility. She had succeeded in securing her future, and ideally, her family's future as well. But she was not to appear triumphant or proud. Engagements were typically long, and during this time, Couples could get to know each other under supervision. The bride-to-be was expected to begin preparing for her future household, learning the management of the home, budgeting, and the art of hosting. Marriage, in theory, was the reward of virtuous womanhood, but in practice, it often marked the beginning of a new and more challenging chapter. A wife was expected to be a moral compass for her husband, a loving and protective mother to her children, and the guardian of the home. She managed the domestic sphere like a silent administrator, overseeing servants, arranging meals, organizing visits, and maintaining appearances. However, her power was largely informal. She had very few legal rights and no political voice. In fact, upon marrying, a woman's legal identity was subsumed into her husband's. She could not vote, own property in her own name until later reforms, or even retain custody of her children in the event of divorce. Yet many women still found ways to exert influence within the home. They managed their households with skill and finesse, educated their children, and sometimes guided their husbands' decisions behind the scenes. Letters from this era show how women used emotional intelligence, subtle persuasion, and keen awareness of social dynamics to shape their worlds. A truly successful Victorian lady never raised her voice, never laughed boisterously, but she was rarely powerless. Motherhood was seen both as a woman's conventional destiny and her divine duty. The ideal mother was gentle, self-sacrificing, and endlessly nurturing. She was expected to educate her children not only in manners, morality, and literacy, but also in patience, humility, and a sense of duty. Boys were to be raised with courage and discipline, while girls were brought up with compassion and grace. But motherhood also brought immense discipline and pressure. A woman struggling with infertility, illness, or maternal depression had very little space to express these struggles. Emotions were to be hidden. Smiles had to be constant. Complaints were unseemly. Women also bore the burden of emotional labor, maintaining peace in the home, healing broken hearts, smoothing over social conflicts, and ensuring that everyone felt comfortable and cared for. Though rarely acknowledged, this invisible labor was essential to the functioning of Victorian society. A woman who could not maintain emotional composure was considered hysterical, unstable, or even morally questionable. Of course, there were exceptions to some rules. In the later Victorian era, we witnessed the rise of the new woman, a figure who defied the traditional mold. Educated, independent, and often unmarried, this woman rode bicycles, attended universities, and even began working in journalism or the arts. She also began appearing in the media. However, such women were the exception, not the norm, and they often faced strong backlash from society. Most women were still expected to live within the traditional boundaries of ladyship, and yet, even within those boundaries, there was a quiet rebellion. Some women used their roles to create salons, write under pseudonyms, or support social reforms through their husbands. Others taught their daughters to question the status quo while appearing obedient. The Victorian lady, though outwardly submissive, was often deeply complex. She had to be. The circumstances of the time demanded it. When emotional expression was allowed, it took quite refined forms. Tears were acceptable only in moments of shared grief or religious contemplation. A woman could express melancholy through poetry or by sighing wistfully while looking out a window, but never through dramatic displays. Anger, jealousy, and lust were forbidden emotions for women, banished from polite conversation, and suppressed beneath layers of etiquette. This repression eventually created a dual existence: the outward woman who followed the script, and the inner woman who harbored an entire universe of longing and thought behind her eyes. Among other women, particularly close friends, some emotional openness was permitted. Female friendships in the Victorian era were often intense and deeply affectionate. Among women, especially those raised in all-female households or schools, letters exchanged were full of tenderness and longing. Some of these friendships were romantic in nature, though not always physically consummated. Society allowed women to grow emotionally close to each other in ways it did not allow with men, and many found in these friendships a rare form of comfort and honesty. And yet, the pressure never completely subsided. A lady had to uphold the values of chastity, humility, and virtue, not only for herself, but also to set an example for others. She was judged by other women more harshly, sometimes more harshly, than by men. An inappropriate gesture, an unaccompanied walk, a slightly too low-cut dress, these could ruin a reputation faster than any scandal could. Women had to pay attention to these matters. All of this was supported not only by laws and rules, but also by a complex web of social rituals and unspoken codes. Afternoon teas, charity events, calling hours, dances, all provided opportunities for observation and subtle judgment. A lady's smile or smirk had to be practiced. Her silence was intentional. Her knowledge had to be limited. She might know French, Latin, the history of the Reformation, or the structure of a Shakespearean sonnet, but she must never appear too intelligent. Intelligence was allowed, and even appreciated, only if softened by humility and always placed after grace. The contradiction at the heart of Victorian ladyhood was this: women were expected to be morally superior to men, more refined, more self-controlled, more ethical, but were given less freedom, less initiative, and fewer rights. They were seen as the guardians of civilization, yet they were confined to the home and rarely allowed to go beyond it. They were expected to be beautiful, but not vain, intelligent, but not opinionated, passionate in love, but never pursuing it. Every step they took was within the invisible cage of expectations, and yet many of them thrived within it because they were resilient, adaptable, and surprisingly resourceful. They found joy in music, comfort in companionship, meaning in motherhood, and sometimes power in the very roles meant to confine them. It was a strength that was not loud or combative, but enduring and patient. A strength born from grace under pressure, kindness in the face of scorn, and self-control, perfected to an art. As we continue, we'll discover more: the subtleties of fashion and symbolism, the unspoken codes of mourning and attire, the domestic arts that defined femininity, and the legacy left behind by Victorian ideals. For to understand how to behave like a proper Victorian lady is not merely to imitate a style. It is to step into a world of layered meanings, delicate rules, and lasting impacts. These can never be skipped. If the spirit of the Victorian lady was cloaked in virtue and silence, her physical form was wrapped in layers of textiles. Each layer communicated something far beyond ordinary fashion. In the world of Victorian propriety, clothing was not merely a matter of personal style or comfort. It was a language, an armor, and a system of rules. It dictated where she could go, how she would be perceived, and what would be whispered about her after she left the room. Dressing appropriately was not just about keeping up with fashion. It was an act of discipline, moral clarity, and above all, social obedience. Let's begin with the most basic idea: modesty and humility. A proper Victorian lady would never reveal her arms, legs, shoulders, or décolletage in any inappropriate context. Collars were high, sleeves long, and skirts reached the floor, often weighted at the hem to prevent revealing too much even while walking. Corsets, petticoats, chemises, crinolines, and bustles were layered under outer garments to hide the body, while emphasizing the waist and silhouette. Interestingly, the act of shaping the body into this ideal hourglass form was viewed not as sexual, but moral. It symbolized order, femininity, and control. Corsets deserve special attention. Modern interpretations often frame them as instruments of patriarchal oppression. And yes, they were restrictive, but within their tight embrace lay cultural significance. A tightly laced corset symbolized a woman's self-discipline. Binding oneself into such a garment each morning was a voluntary commitment to the ideal of discipline. A loosely worn corset was seen not just as careless, but as a sign of moral laxity. The phrase "loose woman" carried both literal and metaphorical weight. Such was the precision of the era. However, this highly structured wardrobe also required assistance, often from another woman. Daughters helped mothers, maids helped mistresses, and sisters helped each other fasten hooks and laces. Dressing was not a mundane task, but a social ritual, a bonding moment, a training ground for the next generation of ladies. In wealthy households, a lady's maid was not merely a servant, but a trusted confidant, skilled in fabric care, hair arrangement, and the fine art of mending. A lady wearing gloves that didn't match her shoes or an uneven hem risked social embarrassment. Thus, the maid's role was critical. In the Victorian era, fashion was highly seasonal, and a proper lady adjusted her wardrobe not only to the weather, but also to the time of day, the occasion, and her social status. Morning dresses were typically modest and simple, often made of cotton or wool. Afternoon dresses were more formal and adorned with lace, ribbons, or embroidery. For tea, a lady might wear a lighter, more elegant garment, while evening dresses were the most extravagant. Silks, satins, and dark, rich colors reserved strictly for post-sunset hours. Colors had a language of their own. White symbolized purity and was widely worn by young unmarried women during their debut or coming-out balls. Deep reds and purples were reserved for mature or high-ranking women. Black was associated with mourning and followed a strict tradition. Especially after the death of a family member, a widow was expected to wear full mourning attire, entirely black, with no jewelry or adornment, for a specific period, typically 1 year and 1 day. Then came the half-mourning periods, when she could wear pale shades like gray, lilac, or lavender. The transition from deep mourning to color marked a symbolic re-entry into society and had to be handled delicately. Jewelry and ornaments also carried meaning. A proper lady would never flaunt her wealth in a vulgar or excessive manner. Pearls symbolized innocence. Cameos reflected classical taste. Lockets often contained hair or miniature portraits of loved ones. Mourning jewelry made of jet or onyx became an industry in itself after Prince Albert's death and Queen Victoria's lifelong mourning that followed. Wearing too much jewelry, or worse, fake jewelry, was considered vulgar and a sign of poor upbringing. It also violated the rules of etiquette. Accessories served both as tools and symbols. Gloves were always worn in public and removed only in very specific settings, like dining or dancing. A woman would never touch an ungloved man's hand, and handshakes were reserved for formal introductions. These rules were significant. Fans were not just cooling devices, they were instruments of flirtation, coded communication, and visual grace. A fluttering fan could signify amusement, modesty, or interest, depending on how it was held or moved. Hats were absolutely non-negotiable. A lady would never go outside with her head uncovered. Bonnets, wide-brimmed straw hats, and veiled caps served not only as protection from the sun, but also as indicators of age, marital status, and activity. A girl taking a walk in the garden might wear a simple straw bonnet, while a married woman going to church or shopping would prefer a velvet hat with feathers. Indoors, the hat was removed, but only once seated and always with dignity. Hairstyles during that time were also a matter of great care. Loose hair was considered extremely improper in public. Only young, unmarried girls wore their hair down. For women, hair was usually parted in the center, braided or curled, and pinned tightly at the nape. Curls were added for evening events. Elaborate buns signified home management and class, because servants had to help create and maintain these styles. Ideal hair was shiny, thick, and modestly arranged. Flashy or overly fashionable styles implied vanity. Vanity was never acceptable, and yet, within these endless restrictions, women found ways to express themselves. Embroidery became an outlet for creativity, stitching initials onto linen, adding special floral patterns to hems or handkerchiefs. Some women took pride in maintaining their own clothing, carefully washing delicate fabrics or starching a collar just so. Others commissioned custom-made garments with hidden touches sewn into the lining. Secret pockets, romantic messages, or family crests. Fashion magazines like Godey's Lady's Book or The Queen guided women on what was acceptable and stylish. These publications did more than showcase trends. They reinforced the ideology of femininity. Articles on fashion were interspersed with moral lessons, domestic advice, and cautionary tales. To be stylish without being frivolous was the line a proper Victorian lady had to walk. Not crossing that line was of great importance. One may ask, weren't these rules oppressive and difficult to follow? Certainly they were strict, but many women embraced them not as a burden, but as a form of order. Even beauty, dressing appropriately, was a ritual, a reflection of inner harmony. A carefully laced corset, a boot polished to shine, a ribbon chosen to match the color of one's eyes. These were not just external adornments, but ways to assert dignity in a world that offered few other paths. Beneath it all lay deeper symbols. To dress well meant to be self-sufficient. It showed not only control over one's appearance, but also over one's passions and impulses. It declared that the woman inside the dress was serious, reliable, and worthy of respect. When a woman entered a drawing room or descended a staircase in this era, she was not merely displaying a garment. She was performing a social role, and every bow, pleat, and pearl was accepted as part of that performance. Fashion also reinforced the categorization of spaces. A working woman could never afford to wear the multi-layered, restrictive garments of upper-class ladies. Thus, a lady's dress marked her as someone who did not need to work. Even discomfort, tight shoes, stiff corsets, heavy skirts, became a strange kind of status symbol. It said, "I belong to a world where appearance matters more than practicality. I am served by people, I do not serve them." Yet, assuming it was all shallow imitation would be a mistake. Many women found personal meaning in their clothing. They knew how to save fabric scraps as memories of past dances or courtships. Wedding dresses were preserved for years, sometimes turned into christening gowns for children. Clothes were intimate objects layered with memories, emotions, and identity. Even the act of undressing, something we now see as mundane, was ritualized. A lady did not simply take off her clothes. She withdrew to her room, allowed her maid to assist, and carefully folded, brushed, perfumed, and sometimes prayed over each item. Her nightgown, though simple, was still modest, made of fine linen or cotton, often embroidered at the collar and cuffs. A lady, even when alone, was never to be seen in disarray. This respect for clothing and formality was reflected in art, literature, and photography. Portraits of Victorian women often showed them in their finest clothes, posing beside objects and accessories, symbolizing taste, books, flowers, musical instruments. These were not incidental props. They told a story in paintings and photographs. The fabric told a story. The jewelry told a story. And so did the woman's expression. Calm, yet often pointing to something deeper, a feeling tightly folded beneath the lace. To be a proper Victorian lady was to live like a form of visual poetry. Every garment, every dress, every button, every stitch was a stanza. The body became the page. And though from our modern perspective, it may appear as cryptic verse, its lines were legible to those who lived it. They knew how to read the hemline, how to speak through fabric, how to shape identity through silhouette. To an outsider, Victorian homes appeared to be places of peaceful order, embroidered cushions, polished and clean banisters, white porcelain teacups. But for the lady who managed it, the home was a theater of constant, invisible labor. It was her domain, her moral responsibility, and often her burden. A proper Victorian lady was expected to manage this domestic sphere, not only in action, but in spirit. The home was not just where she lived. It was where her womanhood was proved. Victorian ideology firmly placed women in the private sphere, while men occupied the public sphere. Men went to work, fought wars, and debated politics. Women stayed behind closed doors, managing the hearth and the heart. Yet far from being idle, the lady of the house was expected to work with precision, intelligence, and decisiveness, maintaining the complex choreography of routine, appearance, and social grace that kept the home a sanctuary of elegance. Above all, she was a manager of time, resources, and people. Even with servants, she was responsible for ensuring meals were served properly, sheets were ironed, guests received accordingly, and nothing in the home was ever lacking. This required deep and detailed knowledge of seasons, menus, etiquette, and moods. A lady was not merely decorative. She was a silent commander, running her home with unseen hands. The day began early. A proper lady rose before the household, usually between 6 and 7 in the morning. After morning prayers or devotionals, perhaps reading a psalm or a passage from the Bible, she would review the day's agenda. Her morning toilette was efficient but thorough. Hair neatly brushed and arranged, a dress chosen according to the day's demands, gloves, hat, and parasol prepared. Before breakfast, she might walk in the garden, tend to correspondence, or oversee breakfast arrangements. Meal planning was a delicate operation. A lady had to ensure that the meals were balanced, seasonally fresh, and respectable. Menus were expected to reflect abundance without extravagance, a difficult contradiction requiring skill. Breakfasts were hearty. They included porridge, smoked fish, eggs, and toast. Luncheons were lighter, usually cold meats or savory pies. Afternoon tea, a ritual in itself, featured carefully cut scones, cakes, biscuits, and sandwiches. The grandest meal of the day, dinner, was served in courses: soup, fish, roast, pudding, dessert, and fruit. Wine pairings had to be appropriate, silverware polished, and the tablecloth spotless. Even if cooks prepared the meals, it was the lady who planned them, oversaw the budget, and selected the china. She kept a household account book with meticulous records, balancing income and expenditure down to the last penny. Wastefulness was a moral flaw. Frugality was a virtue. It was said a woman's worth could be judged by the cleanliness of her pantry and the placement of her cutlery. Housekeeping was not just a routine concern, but a moral obligation. Dust equated to laziness, stains to shame. A proper lady inspected mantelpieces, staircases, and parlors daily, checking for disorder and making subtle corrections. Rugs and carpets were swept, not vacuumed. Wood was polished by hand. Curtains were changed seasonally. Windows cleaned with vinegar and newspaper. Even the air had to be refreshed each morning by opening windows. No matter how cold it was, servants, if present, were a critical part of this system. But they did not manage the home unsupervised. The lady interviewed them before hiring, directed their tasks, supervised their work, and maintained a tone that was firm but kind. It was not unusual for a lady to write schedules for the staff or keep records of when the bed linens were last changed. Woe to the servant who let the coal bucket run empty or left ashes beneath the grate. That era was that precise. Even in smaller homes without staff, the lady performed these tasks herself, often rising earlier still to bake bread, prepare broth, mend garments, or polish boots. Daughters were trained from a young age to help, setting tables, folding sheets, sorting rice. These actions were not mere chores. They were rites of passage. Managing a home was earning one's place as a proper woman. Letter writing was another art that required sensitivity and finesse. In an age without short messages or quick calls, letters carried both emotional weight and social consequence. A lady's handwriting was part of her signature. It had to be elegant, legible, and measured. Ink blots or crossed-out words were frowned upon. Stationery was carefully chosen, white or cream paper, smooth to the touch, often with a monogram or decorative border. Sealing wax with a personal stamp added an extra layer of refinement. Letters were expected to be properly formatted: salutation, opening, closing, and tailored to the recipient. A letter to an aunt required affectionate respect. One to a friend allowed for gentle wit. Writing too briefly was rude. Too effusively, suspicious. A well-composed letter reflected a well-ordered mind. Many young ladies practiced for years before their correspondence was considered ready for broader eyes. A lady also had to master the art of hosting. Entertaining guests was not just about food and drink. It was about making others feel welcomed, seen, and honored. A proper hostess greeted guests at the door, offered refreshments, and guided conversation with grace. She never spoke too much of herself and took care to include everyone present. She could sense if a room was too quiet or if a topic became too controversial. Her goal was balance, her reward, admiration. The parlor was her stage. Here she served tea, discussed novels, or inquired about family members with genuine interest. Music often played a role, either from a small gramophone or a daughter playing the piano. A woman who played or sang could showcase her talents, but only if invited. Modesty was always in fashion, and even talent had to be displayed with humility. Floral arrangements were another area of her creativity. Flowers were not merely decorations, they conveyed messages. The Victorian language of flowers, or floriography, allowed ladies to communicate through petals. A red rose symbolized love, a white lily purity, and forget-me-nots eternal remembrance. Arranging flowers for the drawing room table, entrance hall, or a sick room required knowledge of color harmony, scent, compatibility, and seasonal appropriateness. A single misplaced blossom could speak louder than words. Raising children was perhaps their most sacred duty. If married, a Victorian lady was expected to bear and raise children who would reflect the moral backbone of the nation. Discipline, religion, cleanliness, and routine were the foundational pillars of early education. Harsh punishments were not encouraged, gentle corrections were preferred. Though views varied from household to household, a mother was to be affectionate but not indulgent, firm but never harsh. She was to teach her daughters needlework, kindness, and piety, her sons respect, ambition, and self-control. Yet a woman's power in the home was often paradoxical. She was responsible, but not truly free. She managed everything, but owned nothing. The home, the money, even the children legally belonged to her husband. Still, within those walls, she had created a domain where her taste, discipline, and intelligence reigned supreme. The home was not her prison, it was her canvas. In daily life, afternoons were reserved for visits and social duties. Visiting neighbors or receiving callers was governed by such rigid etiquette that it might seem absurd today. One never called unannounced. No one ever arrived unexpectedly, stayed too long, or visited during mealtimes. Calling cards were essential. Small, cream-colored rectangles with the lady's name and sometimes her address. These were left on silver trays and indicated who had called and when. A folded corner signified a personal visit, a handwritten message, a condolence, or greeting. Evenings were generally quiet, unless there was a dinner, visit, or ball to attend. A lady might read by the fire, write letters, knit, or converse with her family. The day ended with prayer, hair brushing, and contemplation. Her nightgown was modest, her slippers warm, her spirit at peace, and always, throughout the day, she maintained her composure. A Victorian lady was never frantic, rude, or harsh. She bore sorrow and loss in silence, endured grief with grace, and accepted joy with quiet gratitude. Too much emotion risked appearing unbalanced or hysterical. Control was everything. Her voice was soft, her steps light, her presence serene. She was the moral compass her family aligned with, the calm center of the domestic storm. There was power in this role, hidden, silent power. Victorian women may not have ruled parliaments, clubs, political parties, or banks, but they ruled hearts and homes. She was the guardian of culture, the keeper of values, the teacher of the next generation. Through domestic rituals, she shaped the society that confined her. Going out as a Victorian woman was not a simple or casual act. It was a production, governed by intricate rules, dictating what to wear, how to behave, whom to greet, what to say, and how long to stay. Her public presence reflected not only her status, but her entire moral character. One did not merely walk, one glided. One did not simply travel, one was seen. And one certainly did not draw attention. The ideal Victorian lady was visible but modest, social but shy, a walking contradiction wrapped in skirts and propriety. Before stepping outside, a proper lady first attended to her appearance. Her attire was never an afterthought. It was an expression of her class, taste, and self-discipline. Every outfit was carefully selected to match the time of day and the occasion. Morning visits required lighter fabrics and pastel tones, nothing overly bold. Afternoon walks typically required practical but polished attire, including a walking dress, gloves, and a modest veiled hat. Evening engagements allowed for more decorative garments in satin, lace, and rich colors, but never anything crossing a line into vulgarity. Gloves were essential. No proper woman, except perhaps at the seaside, would show bare hands in public. Gloves were symbols of elegance and hygiene, but also of femininity, especially in the presence of a gentleman. Removing gloves was a meaningful act, never done thoughtlessly. The art of walking among people in the street or promenading was one of the most closely observed aspects of a woman's conduct. Strolls in parks and main streets were common. Yet even these simple walks were performances. Ladies were expected to walk gracefully and gently, with steps neither too fast, which suggested masculine energy or impatience, nor too slow, which implied laziness or aimlessness. Their posture was upright but relaxed, their gaze cast downward or modestly forward, making eye contact WW. If a gentleman doffed his hat or nodded in acknowledgement, a lady would only respond if they had been formally introduced. Otherwise, she kept her gaze steady and her movements calm. Smiling at a stranger risked social disapproval. The street was not a place to flirt. It was a moral corridor. When visiting a shop, the same rules applied. A woman greeted the shopkeeper politely, requested items softly, and never bargained or raised her voice. She avoided lingering or unnecessarily touching goods. Even the manner of payment, usually by account or carefully counted coins, was measured. Except for picnics or formal outings, she did not eat in public. Being seen chewing while walking was considered terribly inappropriate. When attending social visits, known as calls, timing was especially important. No one called before noon, and afternoon calls were limited to a specific window, usually between 3 and 5 p.m. Visits were brief, generally 15 to 20 minutes. Too short was rude. Too long was an imposition. If the hostess was not at home, the visitor left a calling card with a servant or placed it on the designated tray in the entrance hall. These cards were collected and reviewed regularly, serving as a social ledger. In conversation, a proper Victorian lady behaved with restraint and elegance, speaking in a gentle tone. She never interrupted. She never raised her voice. Topics such as money, illness, or politics, especially in mixed company, were avoided. Her language was modest, free of slang or coarse humor. Bodily functions were only referred to in the most vague terms, and unladylike words were never used. Euphemisms abounded. Legs were limbs. A pregnant woman was said to be in a delicate condition, and undergarments were only whispered about, if at all. When going to the theater or opera, a woman wore her finest evening dress, accompanied by gloves, a fan, and perhaps a small handbag. She arrived precisely on time and refrained from speaking during the performance. Applause was expected, but never shouting or whistling. A proper lady did not eat during a show or display excessive excitement. Her enjoyment was sincere, expressed with a faint smile or gentle clapping. Travel presented its own rules. A lady rarely traveled alone. If she had to, she was accompanied by a maid, a family member, or a trusted male escort. On trains, she chose ladies-only compartments whenever possible. She avoided public transport, buses, or carriages, unless necessary, and never sat close to unfamiliar men. Her luggage was modest, only what she could reasonably carry or supervise, and always, her demeanor remained composed. Travel was no excuse for sloppiness. Interacting with men in public was one of the most delicate areas of Victorian etiquette. A lady did not begin a conversation with a man unless he was a close relative or longtime family acquaintance. Introductions and meetings were always facilitated by a mutual acquaintance. A lady never touched a man unless absolutely necessary. Even a handshake was considered too familiar in many circles. When speaking with men, her tone was respectful, her gaze slightly averted, her replies concise and courteous. If a man offered his hand while walking, a lady accepted only if he was a family member or suitor. When offered a seat, she thanked him gently and only sat once the chair had been positioned. In carriages, she expected him to open the door and assist her inside. These gestures were not merely gallant, they were choreography of status, respect, and decorum. The fans they constantly used were more than just accessories. They were communication tools. In an age where open flirtation was forbidden, a lady could send subtle signals with a flick of the wrist. Holding a fan to her heart meant love. Tapping it on her chin meant curiosity. Closing it sharply indicated disinterest. Manuals detailing the language of the fan were published to help ladies express themselves within the rigid rules of acceptable behavior. Even sitting required discipline. A lady never slouched or spread her legs. Her feet were kept together, her back straight, her hands gently folded in her lap. She never crossed her legs at the knees, only at the ankles, and only when seated for a long time. Her parasol stood beside her or hung gently from her wrist. Her reticule remained closed. Her gloves stayed on unless removed for a very formal dinner. When invited to dinner, timing and manners were of utmost importance. She arrived precisely on time, never early, and never more than 15 minutes late. Upon entering, she greeted the host and hostess with a curtsy or verbal acknowledgement. At the table, she waited humbly for the host to signal the meal's start, often with a glance or subtle gesture. She ate from every course, but never overindulged. She avoided reaching across the table, and her napkin remained neatly folded on her lap. Wine was accepted or declined with a nod, and she never drained her glass or sipped excessively. Conversation was kept light. Literature, art, weather, current, non-political events. Even her laughter was subject to social norms. A lady's laugh was soft, melodic, and brief. Loud or boisterous laughter was considered vulgar and unrefined. One laughed with control, not to mock, but to express refined amusement. If something was especially amusing, she might smile and lower her gaze, perhaps dabbing the corner of her mouth with a handkerchief. Nothing beyond this was permitted. Victorian women were trained to prioritize politeness and elegance above personal comfort in everything. If their shoes were tight, They endured it. If the weather was hot, they did not remove their gloves. When uncomfortable in a dull environment, they smiled politely. It was unthinkable to place their own desires above courtesy. They were always a reflection of their family's reputation and their own self-respect. Yet within this structure, Victorian ladies found subtle ways to express themselves. The tilt of a bonnet, the choice of a ribbon, a phrase added to a letter. These were the threads of individuality woven into the fabric of tradition. Though the rules seemed rigid, there were opportunities to shine quietly, to navigate the social world with grace and restraint. While many aspects of Victorian womanhood centered around appearance, posture, and social etiquette, a proper lady was not merely an ornament for her husband or a symbol of family pride. She was also expected to cultivate her intellect, but only within socially accepted boundaries. When applied with restraint and humility, knowledge was seen as a mark of refinement. However, too much intellectual ambition could be dangerous. A knowledgeable woman was admirable. A blue stocking was suspicious. Education for girls during the Victorian era varied greatly according to class. Young ladies of the upper class were typically educated at home, either by governesses or private tutors. Their lessons began early, often at 5 or 6 years old, with a strong emphasis on literacy, music, penmanship, and foreign languages. Subjects like mathematics and science were generally considered unnecessary beyond the basics. For a girl, reading French and playing the piano were far more important than mastering algebra or chemistry. A culture of reading was a principle at the heart of Victorian women's intellectual lives. Literature, especially poetry, moral essays, religious texts, and carefully selected novels, was encouraged. Books by Jane Austen, Sir Walter Scott, and Charles Dickens were acceptable, particularly those promoting virtue, patience, and family loyalty. Reading was a sign of refinement, but it had to be done delicately. One did not boast about reading many books. Additionally, controversial authors or modern philosophies were not discussed in mixed company. When a lady was seen reading a book, her posture and manner of sitting were important. She sat upright, holding the book at chest level or on a lap desk. Her facial expressions were controlled. Even when reading fiction, one must not appear overly emotional. Tears were acceptable when reading about noble sorrows, but uncontrolled laughter or visible distress were frowned upon. The image of a lady reading quietly by the fire evoked one of the most famous portraits of Victorian womanhood: peaceful, modest, thoughtful, and composed. A lady might also keep a diary, though the subject of journaling was generally a private matter. She would record her thoughts and memories, note moral reflections, perhaps copy passages from the Holy Bible or poetry, and sometimes recount her daily routine. However, her inner world was filtered, never crude, bitter, or suggestive of rebellion. Her writings reflected the values she had been taught: obedience, gratitude, kindness, and restraint. Some women with adventurous spirits preferred correspondence as a form of intellectual expression. Letters exchanged between friends, sisters, or mothers and daughters were filled with warmth, wit, and quiet insight. Through these correspondences, Victorian women could explore their thoughts relatively safely. They could develop ideas, offer advice, and cultivate a voice that was both graceful and articulate. Many women began to see letter writing as the highest form of self-expression. formal educational institutions for women began to appear more clearly from the mid to late 19th century. For example, finishing schools focused more on social grace and cultural education than on rigorous academic instruction. Girls learned to dance, paint, recite poetry, and speak foreign languages. These accomplishments, known as feminine refinement, were considered essential for securing a good marriage and solidifying one's place in society, and it could be said that they were quite effective. But within these limits, many women quietly pursued more serious studies. Some learned Latin and Greek, wrote theses under male pseudonyms, or formed reading circles where they discussed deeper subjects such as theology, history, or even political thought. A truly proper Victorian lady would never boast of such knowledge, but if asked, she might quote an author, offer a concise reference, or display her learning in the most refined way. The art of music was another area where a lady could show both talent and discipline. Every respectable home had a piano, and every young girl was expected to spend hours each week practicing to improve. She might also learn to sing, play the harp, or, if from a more liberal family, play the violin. Public performances were rare unless arranged for charity or private salons. Even then, she played not to impress, but to please and uplift. Art also had its place. Watercolor painting, drawing, embroidery, and decorative needlework were considered suitable hobbies for a lady. These were not merely distractions or pastimes. Each required patience, taste, and control. They taught precision, beauty, and perseverance, qualities reflecting the ideal female character. When a lady discussed her skills or knowledge, she did so with humility. Being perceived as proud or showy was social suicide. In fact, though fluent, she might say, "I dabble a bit in French," or she might remark, "I've read some of Mr. Tennyson's poems," when she had memorized entire stanzas. Modesty was everything. A proper lady let her actions speak, never her pride. During this time, pride and arrogance were never to be at the forefront. Religion played a central role in shaping intellectual and moral life. A woman attended church regularly, studied and learned the Bible, and upheld Christian values in all she did. She was taught to be charitable, to pray daily, and to endure life's hardships with patience and honor. Her spiritual reflections were often her most intimate intellectual exercises. They offered a way to make sense of pain, seek purpose, and cultivate humility. The tension between intelligence and modesty, ambition and duty, was constant. A Victorian lady was not expected to seek fame, leadership, or academic praise. Yet many, restricted by society but inspired by their own minds, found ways to contribute to the world. Some became writers under pseudonyms. Others taught in schools, worked in missions, or became quiet reformers within their communities. They read about other women, Florence Nightingale, who transformed nursing into a respected profession, Mary Somerville, who wrote scientific texts, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who infused poetry with passion and thought. These figures provided models for what a woman could be, even as society still insisted on silence and obedience. The evolving era was beginning to open the way. In private, a proper lady might read history and philosophy. Through lessons or home experiments, she might explore botany or astronomy, but she always wrapped her knowledge in layers of kindness and discretion. Learning was a virtue, but only as long as it never overshadowed her grace. Toward the end of the Victorian era, new opportunities for education began to emerge. Women entered universities, published articles, and joined discussions. Yet the image of the proper Victorian lady persisted, a figure of moderation, beauty, moral clarity, and quiet strength. To behave like a proper Victorian lady was not simply to follow a set of rules. It was to embody a worldview. Every gesture, every word, every silence was a display of virtue. In the tilt of her head, the tone of her voice, the cut of her dress, there was an expectation stretching back centuries. And though we now live in a world less bound by corsets and calling cards, the legacy of the Victorian lady remains, a powerful reminder of how women have shaped the world, not with noise, but with grace and quiet command. And now, dear viewer, I invite you once again to reflect on all that you've learned. What surprised you the most? What moved you? What challenged your assumptions? Please take a moment to comment below and tell us. How are you feeling right now? Was there something in our journey through Victorian womanhood that resonated with you? Perhaps you saw echoes of your grandmother, or maybe you recognized glimpses of yourself. As we walk together through petticoats, tea, and timeless discipline, I would love to hear what stirred in your heart. Thank you for watching until the very end. Until next time, stay elegant, stay curious, and wherever you go, carry with you a little piece of Victorian grace.